We interrupt this record to bring you a special bulletin. The reports of a flying saucer hovering over the city have been confirmed.
Did you really go out with an alien? What was it like?
Real different.
Becoming Human, a Mork and Mindy podcast. Hello listeners, this is Paula Schaffner with episode 44, Little Orphan Morkie. The title is, of course, a reference to the Little Orphan Annie comic strip, which was then a successful Broadway musical. This episode first aired on February 7th, 1980. The IMDb synopsis is, when Mork is threatened with deportation, Exidor adopts him. This was the 35th Mork Mindy episode directed by Howard Storm. It was the fourth and last written by the team of Bruce Kalish and Philip John Taylor. We start with a sunny exterior of the house, and as with all of the exteriors where you can see the ground, there is, of course, snow. Mork enters the living room with a small boy who's dressed for winter. They're both carrying grocery bags. There's applause. The boy thanks Mork for covering for him at the grocery store. As Mork lifts the boy onto the bar stool, he says, "That's all right, Judd. I knew what it was like the first time I tried to put a live lobster in a shopping cart." They start to unpack the groceries, which they also bagged. They have some dead bread. It's very flat. But Mork says that they can have pumpernickel tortillas. Judd says it looks like Mork doesn't have to worry about scrambling his eggs either. Mork says, "Not a pretty sight, is it?" "Well, at least they died with their shells on." He salutes them and tells them to rest in pieces. Judd says he's never seen someone get so emotional over eggs. Mork says each one of these eggs represents 76 chicken hours. Judd tells him that ever since he moved into this neighborhood, Mork has been one of his best friends, even though we've never seen this child before or heard of him. He thanks Mork for taking him to the movies. He asks how Mork liked the movie.
Well, for such a conceptually interesting film, I usually like to see it twice. I found the production values reminiscent of Bergman and the dramatic values reminiscent of Fellini. But what bothers me is, why did the coyote, after the Roadrunner blew him up, come back 5 seconds later?
How should I know? I don't even understand what you said.
So we have Mork intellectualizing a Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote film, which apparently played by itself. Judd just being an ordinary kid and not understanding. Judd takes some mail out of his pocket. Mork says to put it on the counter because it's Mindy's. Judd says one of the letters is from Mork. As Judd walks over on the bar stools, Mork says, "Mail for moi?" Judd reads that it's from the U.S. Dep of Imig and Nat. Mork doesn't know anyone named Nat. Mork quickly opens the envelope and then apologizes to it. It's from the Department of Immigration and Naturalization. The greeting is "Dear Sir," so he says that's nice. The body of the letter reads, "With concern to your visit April 19th of last year, we require more information on your alien status. Please contact our office immediately to prevent termination of your U.S. residency. Love, Jimmy." And the audience applauds, including whistles, because they're amused at the idea that President Carter was actually signing these letters with an affectionate sign-off. A lot of this episode calls back to the first season episode Mork and the Immigrant, which actually aired on January 11th, 1979. And I don't think it was set in April, but this is part of the retconning of season 1 that we're seeing in season 2, like the references to Exidor's cabin in the episode Mork's Vacation. Judd still doesn't understand. Mork says he's up the creek without a green card. Judd thinks that being grown up is so confusing. Mork tells him, "I'm sorry, little one." He explains that last year he went to apply for an alien status. They refused him, and he thought they threw away the form, but it seems like they didn't. Judd wonders what this has to do with a creek. And of course, Mork is not going to explain that idiom because it involves profanity. Mork says it means he's going to be deported. Judd wants to know what deported means. Mork says he has to find another place to live, although obviously it's more dramatic than that. It's not like he's moving across town. He's going to go down there and check it out right away. Judd tells him to be careful what he says. Mork says that Judd is right. This is the government. If he tries to duck any questions, they'll think he's chicken and his goose is cooked. So a bunch of foul puns. He says that he'll have to prove to them that he's a fine American. He tries to remember what it says on the Statue of Liberty. Judd says he was there when he was a kid. It says Carlos loves Mary Beth Ovitz, so yet another use of the name Ovitz. Mork says it's almost 4 o'clock. He'd better put on some decent duds and get down to the federal courthouse. Judd says that he'll stay there and tell Mindy where Mork is gone. Mork muses that Carlos must really love Mary Beth. He built that big statue and she's still carrying a torch for him. Then he heads upstairs. There's a very snow-covered exterior of the Boulder County Justice Center, and it's possibly the same shot that we got on the immigrant episode. We can see a judge with balding white hair sitting at the desk. There's a woman, presumably his receptionist, letting in Mork, who's dressed as Uncle Sam. The woman rolls her eyes and exits. She doesn't have any lines, and she's uncredited. The audience laughs and applauds. We cut to the judge, who's looking disapproving, but maybe a little amused.
Dun, 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 dun. America, America, from sea to shining waves of grain. Yeah.
Mork gets the lyrics wrong, but he's certainly enthusiastic. The judge says that Mork must be his 5 o'clock appointment. So we know that it was almost 4 in the earlier scene, and he's managed to get over to the Justice Center and apparently get a walk-in appointment. Mork says he's certainly not the judge's 5 o'clock shadow, and then he does his bark laugh. Mork says he's just your typical patriotic American citizen. He's sorry he's late, but he had to stop by Mom's Diner to have a piece of apple pie, a cold beer, eat a hot dog, watch a baseball game, catch a pass, join the army, move to the suburbs, and shoot a deer. This is the first of a couple things of Mork claiming to do very typically American things. He takes the Constitution out of his pocket. He says he doesn't know why he carries it around because he memorized it years ago. The judge says, "Mr. Mork, is it?" Mork says, "Yes, my fellow American, it is." The judge says that Mork's papers say he came from Ork. The judge wonders where exactly that is. Mork leads him over to the window and points up through the blinds. The judge says that it's pretty hard for an alien to get into this country, but it's impossible for a wacky alien to get in. Mork says, "What about Charo?" referring to the very popular Love Boat and similar guest who was also a very talented guitarist and one of the most famous one-name celebrities of the late 70s and now, I guess, early 80s. As they go back to sit down, the judge asks if Mork has any identification papers. Mork just has his Mr. Bill of Rights, and then he says, "Oh no, don't violate me," which is at least the second Mr. Bill imitation. The audience squeals and applauds. The judge says that Mork's enthusiasm is very admirable and his costume is pretty spiffy, but we don't grant citizenship on personality alone. Mork says that the judge can ask him anything about American history. He knows all the answers. Who was Paul Revere's barber? Mr. Benedict of Boston. He can name all the states. Anxiety, depression, fear, catatonic joy, catatonic love, catatonic peace. Pretty negative states, even though when he had mixed emotions, there were some positive ones in there. Mindy enters in that pink turtleneck she wears a lot. The audience applauds, including whistling, probably because we're 6 minutes into the episode and this is her first appearance. She says that Judd told her that Mork was here. He says, "Oh, I am." She says, "Excuse me for barging in like this, Your Honor." The judge asks, "Are you with him or are you normal?" And she says, No, I'm with him." So by this point, Mindy has pretty much given up trying to pass as normal. She would rather side with Mork. The judge says she can help answer a few questions. She says that she thought they cleared all these questions up last year. The judge says that Mork's file is incomplete. If he wants to stay in the country, they'll have to have some more information. Mork says his astrological sign is nefarious with egg rising, which I am sure we've had before. I don't know if this is continuity or recycling a joke. The judge wants to know if Mork has an occupation. Mork says absolutely. He says it's observing your primitive planet. Mindy gasps and grabs his shoulder, so Mork changes his answer to a reasonable planet, a wonderful planet. The judge doesn't really question this. He just asks if there's a lot of money in that, and Mork says not much. He usually makes money doing odd jobs. The judge sarcastically says, "I'll bet." Mindy asks what Mork has to do to stay in the country. The judge says for starters, he can bring his passport and birth certificate. He'll hold Mork's file for 5 days. If Mork doesn't produce his documents by then, he'll be deported. Mork jokes that he probably left his birth certificate with his passport, and then he does his bark laugh. The judge excuses himself to take 2 adult strength pain relievers. Mork asks, "Don't you want me to sing God Bless America in 3-part harmony with subtitles?" The judge says if Mork doesn't bring in those papers, he may be singing God Bless Guatemala. Mindy asks if there's any other way Mork can stay in the country. The judge says not unless he marries an American citizen, and the scene ends. The judge was played by Charles Lane, who was then 74, and he would die in 2007. He pretty much played the same character from at least the 40s into, I think, the 90s. 90s. His appearance never really changed. You can see him in It's a Wonderful Life. He also plays a judge in the late 70s on Soap. He's always this sort of mix of slightly grumpy, slightly sarcastic, dignified, but not heartless kind of man. Just pretty much owned this sort of role and worked a lot. And it's nice to see him here. The material isn't great, but he presents this character who is somewhat patient and tolerant with Mork, although obviously loses his patience enough to need to take some serious headache remedy. And that's the last we see of him. I also want to note that things move really quickly in this episode. Somehow they're going to deport Mork in 5 days, even though they don't really know his country of origin, although apparently they would just be sending him to Guatemala for some reason. So we go back to Mork and Mindy's house, and Mindy is in the kitchen drinking water. As Mork descends the attic stairs, she asks if he's changed yet. He says no, he's still an illegal alien. They've both been thinking over alternatives. He says he could run away, then they'd arrest him, there'd be a brief trial, then a long walk, then death row. Then President Jerry Brown would strap him into a solar-powered electric chair, and it would take a year for Mork to die. So another Jerry Brown reference. I talked about this governor of California on episode 42 when Mrs. Da Vinci was worried about Jerry Brown and the other beatniks. Jerry Brown did actually run for president in 76 and 80, although he was very young then, and he would try again in 1992. And he was interested in solar energy. Obviously, this is not too positive a view of solar energy because Mork sees it as very inefficient. And yes, Mork is making fun of the death penalty. Even though Mork has just rejected the idea of running away, Mindy says that he could run away, but then he'd be a fugitive. Mork says he'd probably be pursued for the rest of his life by a one-armed immigration officer, so playing off of the 60s TV show, The Fugitive. Mindy says he could go to another country, but he'd have trouble getting there without a passport. Although he didn't have a passport to get to the US. I mean, he could just go by egg. Mork says he could stay at the Shaw's place, or as the subtitles on the DVD have it, Charles' place, as if it's a Monopoly square. That is a reference to the exiled Shah of Iran. Mindy thinks it'd be too difficult for him to adjust to another country. I felt like not necessarily. It would depend on the country. I mean, he's already learned some about other countries. I would think the main thing is adjusting to Earth. But I think that she pretty much wants to keep him here in Boulder. Even though she just said he shouldn't go to another country, Mork thinks this is a great idea and she can go with him. They could go to China and they'd be Mork and Ming, like a Ming vase. They could go to Siberia and be Mork and Mindovich. They could go to Italy and be Mork and Mindestroni, which if you ever have a Mork and Mindy themed restaurant, you have to call it that. And they could go to Latvia and be Laverne and Shirley. Again, we have an example of Laverne and Shirley being a series within this series, even though Mork had a blind date with Laverne back in the early 60s. Mork decides that leaving wouldn't work because he doesn't want to take her away from her friends, her life here, or her dentist.
I've got another solution. I'll disguise myself as an American tourist. I'll get a Nikon camera, I'll get a long two-piece leisure suit. That's okay. We'll run some kids, we'll put them in the back, they'll wear little Mickey Mouse ears and go,
Dad, are we going to Disneyland?
I'll be driving on, looking in the rearview mirror and go, Bill, Bob, Joe, Gene, Carl, Joe, down, you shut up, and if Grandpa passes out again, you jumpstart him. Now, come on, let me quiet.
So we get more of Mork playing with stereotypes about a typical American, and Mindy is amused, but she still sees this as a serious situation. She gets up and sets her glass on the counter. Mork follows her. She says the only thing left to do is what the judge suggested, get married. Nobody said he had to marry her. He does know other women, but this is where her mind went to when the judge said it. Mork surprisingly says he couldn't do that because Mindy once said that marriage is a very, very special thing and she only wants to do it once. And I assume this means that Mindy doesn't believe in divorce, but of course I have to point out that her mother died when she was young, and so Fred was single for a really long time, and now he has remarried. Obviously he never planned to do that, but Mindy should realize that even if you have a very, very special marriage, it may not last. Mork says he doesn't want Mindy to waste a marriage on a favor for a friend. So he's friend-zoning them, kind of, although it's a little more complicated. Mindy says she's trying to help him. Mork says it'll be all right. He'll leave and she'll forget about him. He'll forget about her in 200 years. So one, he's going to live a really long time, and I'm not sure how long he's already lived, considering we used to measure time in bleems. And also, he's not going to forget her easily. Mindy says they can't give up now. She sits at the table and he follows. She says they've got 5 whole days to think of something. He thinks he's doomed, and he sits down.
At least I have something to remember you, Barham.
What's that? Can I see?
Well, don't open it.
What is it?
Well, inside's the very first tear you ever shed for me.
Oh, and you carry this with you? Oh, that's so nice.
Well, I hope one day I can... If I ever get real, real lonely, I'll open it up and brush that tear away. It'll almost be like having you there.
I'm wondering, how did he capture that tear without her noticing? You know, that first time that her eyes were leaking. She thinks this is very nice, rather than creepy and kind of stalkery. If you can stalk somebody you live with, it's taken as a gesture of their friendship and their relationship. He will keep it to remember her by, and someday he'll be very, very lonely and he'll wipe it away. And we see in this scene that she is more the optimist here and he's more the pessimist. That's not always true for them. She's trying to think constructively. There's a knock. She gets up to answer it. Mork thinks it's the library because he's overdue on the book Raising Weasels for Fun and Profit. If my roommate was raising weasels in an apartment, I wouldn't be that upset about them being deported, I gotta be honest. If they were kept outside, I might feel differently. It's Judd. Mork calls him Rugbug. Not as good as his nicknames for Eugene, but whatever. I think it's like a variation on Rugrat, maybe? Mork thinks that Judd came by to say goodbye. Actually, Judd saw a TV program about adopting Vietnamese kids. Mork could be adopted like that. Mindy, instead of pointing out that Mork is an adult, thinks this is a great idea. Mork says he's allergic to silk and he doesn't love rice. Like, he thinks he's going to have to pretend to be Vietnamese or to be adopted by Vietnamese people. Judd says rice isn't so bad if you put lots of sugar on it. What's wrong with rice? Who doesn't like rice? I've never in my life heard of anyone who doesn't like rice. And then Judd leaves. Judd was played by 8-year-old Noah Hathaway, who would do a Laverne and Shirley episode in 1982, and according to IMDb, he is still active as an actor. He's okay here. It's just sort of a filler character. It's not really necessary. It almost feels like he was one of the finalists for the audition of Scott Marshall's friends in the episode where Mork was on vacation and the 3 boys in winter clothes found him and brought him home. He does a lot of exposition lead up, like what's deportation, blah, blah, blah. It's not a necessary role. Mork could have left a note for Mindy. They could have come up with this ridiculous adoption idea on their own. The judge could have said something like, oh, well, if he had been adopted as a child, or he could get married now, or something like that. Not to begrudge any Gen Xer a paycheck, but we don't have to have him. It's okay that we have him. He's not an annoying child actor. He's just kind of there. Mindy says they'll have to find an American who will adopt Mork. Then Mork can stay in the country. He wonders who, and she suggests herself. Then we go to commercial. There's yet another sunny exterior of the house, even though by now it's gotta be at least 6 o'clock, and I would think it'd be dark at this point if it's still winter. Mindy is looking up adoption agencies in the phone book. Mork asks her to stop her fingers from walking so his lips can do the talking, and that's a reference to the let your fingers do the walking AT&T commercials and print ads where you'd see fingers on top of phone books. Walking down the street, it's been a while, but that's what I recall. Mork doesn't think it's a good idea for Mindy to adopt him, and it's not because that would change the nature of their relationship. No, nobody brings that up. He says if she adopts him, she'll become his mother. He has a mother back on Orc, and it'll break her little Pyrex heart. Another reference to him being a clone. But the thing is, if Mindy adopts him, how is that different from any other woman adopting him? Or for that matter, a man. Like if Mork has a father, that's not going to hurt his mother's feelings. So they'll have to find someone else to adopt him. Then Bickley knocks. He lets himself in and says, "Hi, kids." There's applause. They both say his name as if they have the same idea. Bickley thanks them for remembering his name. He's holding a cup and wants to borrow some sweet and low. Mindy has him sit down so they can talk. He says he can share the wisdom of his years. They all sit on the couch. Mork asks Bickley his opinion on adoption. Bickley is for it. It gives a guy an excuse to watch Saturday morning cartoons. As if you can't watch Saturday morning cartoons as an adult living by yourself? With your dog, maybe? Mindy says a new son could really bring joy into one's life, and so she's phrasing it kind of generically. Bickley thinks Mork and Mindy are thinking about adopting a little boy. And he doesn't question that they're an unmarried couple. He just thinks it's great because you can get the kid of your choice and the kid gets parents who love him and want him. Everybody wins. However, before you do anything, let Uncle Bickley give you a little advice. If possible, find out everything you can about his background, who his parents were, where he came from, and if he's had his shots. And of course, Mindy does know all that about Mork. Mork asks if Bickley would ask those questions if he was adopting someone. Bickley would ask those questions if he was hiring a gardener. Mindy thanks him for the advice and says they're out of Sweet and Low. Bickley gives her the cup back till they can get some. He borrowed it last year. He stands and says if they get a kid and need a babysitter, they can drop him by Bickley's place through the window. He laughs at himself. As he exits, he says, "Bye, Mork, bye, Mindy," and Mork says, "Bye, America." Mindy is sorry. Mork says it's all right. He's probably too big for Bickley's lap anyway, even though he sat in Bickley's lap on the episode where we found out what a rotten father Bickley is. Mindy says they'll have to find someone who will adopt Mork without asking questions about his past. Mork says he hopes it's not Roy Rogers because if Mork passes on, Roy will have him stuffed and put in his museum. And that's a reference to Roy Rogers' horse Trigger, since that's what happened to him after he died at the age of 30 in 1965. And that's one of those things that's sort of a baby boomer joke that I guess I heard enough references to that I just knew it. I don't know if that's common knowledge anymore. And yes, we had a reference to Dale Evans, Roy Rogers' wife, on the Mork's Vacation episode. We get a closer shot of the Boulder County Justice Center. Mork and Mindy enter the waiting area. It's clearly another day because they've got different outfits on, and he's wearing that red bow tie that he wears for somewhat formal occasions. There's a blonde woman who's uncredited, and she's holding a bundle. We never actually see the face of her baby, so I think it's just a prop. They sit on her bench in the front. The woman is very excited. Mork says he is too. The woman asks, "Where's the little one?" Mork says, "You're looking at him." The woman says, "You're here to be adopted?" Mindy says the bigger ones are always the last to go. The woman asks if Mindy is adopting Mork, and she says, "No, not me." The door opens, and Exidor enters in a pinstripe suit with a tie and a briefcase. And I want to believe that that briefcase was sold to him by Nelson. Of course, you knew from the synopsis who this person who would not ask about Mork's past would be, and it does make some sense within the Mork and Mindy universe, although nowhere in this episode do they mention that Exidor is still a newlywed with Ambrosia, unless she has already left him. The audience squeals and applauds at Exidor's entrance. He tells one of his followers to put that thing away. There are ladies present. Mork calls Exidor's name, and Exidor says, "Son, is that you?" Mork says, "Dad." Exidor says, "Morkie," and they hug. So it's a variation on their usual, "Exidor, Mork, is that you?" routine.
Here's the present I got you. You left it in the other office. Careful, it's still got its claws.
You're the best dad in the whole world.
Yes.
So as usual, Robin is playing along with Robert Donner, and Mork is playing along with Exidor. We don't find out what the gift is other than it has claws. Mindy takes Exidor's overcoat and says they can't thank him enough for doing this. Exidor says he'd do anything for this waif, meaning Mork, even dress up in this ridiculous outfit. And we know from previous episodes that Mork is Exidor's best friend. Mork has passed every other interview. I don't know how many interviews they've gone through, considering this has been at most 4 days. This one's the big one. Mindy wonders if Exidor remembers what he's supposed to do. He says certainly. He'll act dignified, respectful, and just as crazy as the rest of the people in this world. So confirmation that Exidor thinks he's the only sane one. He's able to do this because he's great at impressions. He sits next to the blonde lady and says, "Hello, lovely day." She says yes. He says, "Charming child." She says, "Why, thank you." And then he says to Mork and Mindy, "Madcap enough?" He tells Monrix, "Don't chew on that lady's skirt." The woman looks at her skirt. Exidor tells her, "Lucky for you, polyester doesn't fray." The woman moves to the back bench and sits next to the family sitting there. Mindy tells Mork they're in big trouble. Mork looks a little worried. A middle-aged woman enters from a side door and calls to Mr. Exidor. Throughout the episode, Exidor and Mork are treated like their last names, although I feel like they're their only names, like Charo, or maybe first names. Mindy wishes Mork good luck and he thanks her. Exeter stands and Mindy quietly tells him not to talk too much and to just play it cool. He says he'll be cool as a night in Siberia. And then he tells Steinmetz to wash that before he puts it in his mouth. So at least the third appearance of Steinmetz. Because I always notice these things, I have to point out that there is a wall calendar that starts on a Tuesday and has 31 days. Usually on TV shows, nothing matches up or quite fits. This actually works for January 1980, also July 1980, but that feels a bit late for this. And that would fit with it being snowy. Mork tells the woman lovely day. She says yes and asks who's adopting whom. Mork says he's Mr. Mork and this is his father-to-be, Mr. Exeter. The woman says, I see. I have the papers here of your interviews today. So it's just all apparently been in one day. Like I said, things move quickly on this episode. But essentially, the question of adoption rests on this meeting. So what was the point of all the other interviews? Mindy is leaning forward anxiously and she's sitting on the front bench again. This woman is actually credited. The character's name is Miss Kalinowski, and she's played by 52-year-old Priscilla Murill, who would have been very recognizable at that time because she played Lou Grant's wife and then ex-wife Edie on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And she also was Chrissy Snow's mother on an early Three's Company episode. She would have a different role the next season. She tends to bring a certain gravitas, but also kindness to her, which is probably more than this role deserves. But as with Charles Lane, it's nice to have. And yes, her character being referred to as Miss means that she's unmarried, but we don't know if she is a single mom or not. She asks for Exeter's references, but he doesn't say anything. Mork says the references are in the briefcase. Exeter repeats this and then opens the briefcase. There is a cut to Mindy. Exeter hands Miss Kalinowski a sheet of paper. He shows Mork a rubber chicken and exclaims, "Lunch!" Mork has him hide it in the briefcase again. Mindy puts her head in her hand and then lowers her hand, still looking worried. Miss Kalinowski skims Exeter's references. He's a doctor of philosophy, so she starts to call him Mr. and then changes it to Doctor. And we did learn on a couple of earlier episodes that Exeter was a doctor, but I guess I assumed he was a medical doctor. Exeter studied with Spinoza. Miss Kalinowski points out that Spinoza has been dead for many years. Exeter says, "No wonder I never got my report card." Spinoza was a 17th century philosopher, so yes, it has been many years since he passed on. Mindy comes over and says it's Mel Spinoza, a friend of Exeter's from Harvard. I don't know why Harvard, but maybe just sounds more prestigious. She says it's just a little joke. Miss Kalinowski says this is not a place for levity. She tells Exeter, "Doctor, it could cost you a son." He says, "Of course." Mindy backs away and sits down again.
The key question is, why do you want to adopt someone as old as Mork?
Why? My dear lady, where is it written that a person is not entitled to love after a certain age? What you see before you are two people with complementary needs. He to have a father, I to be one. What calloused heart would deny the fulfillment of this just because one of us isn't wearing diapers?
You really do love each other, don't you? Oh.
She bought it.
Dr. Exeter, I had my doubts, but you're a fine man. You have a son.
Junior, mon cher papa.
The music emphasizes this touching speech, which is, of course, false. Miss Kalinowski is genuinely moved. I do have to wonder how she doesn't hear Exeter saying she bought it when Mindy can hear it over on the bench. And we again have Mork speaking French, and the audience is pleased. Miss Kalinowski says the papers have to be notarized, and then they'll need to bring them back here. Exeter says her wish is his command. Exeter and Mork go over to Mindy, who stands. She says, "We did it!" So she definitely sees this as a team effort. Mork calls Exeter brilliant. Exeter says if they could bag what he just said over there, they could double the corn crop in Kansas. So basically, it's manure. The woman calls over to them to be careful with the papers. They're the only ones they have. I have to point out, there were photocopy machines by this point. In fact, an important segment in the movie 9 to 5, which came out later in 1980, has Jane Fonda's character dealing with a photocopier, so it wouldn't have been that difficult for Miss Kalinowski to run off another copy of the paperwork, and this is just pretty sloppy of the bureaucracy. Exeter tells her not to worry, but then he ducks, causing Mork to also duck. He says, Pepe, don't throw that frisbee in here. Miss Kalinowski looks confused and worried. Exeter, Mork, and Mindy exit quickly. So we see that Pepe is back, even though he and Ambrosia didn't get along, so that again makes me wonder if Ambrosia is out of the picture. Certainly Exeter does not point out that he is a married man, and it would have been very cute if he had brought Ambrosia with him, and then we would have had a chance to see Georgia Engel again. I don't know how she would feel about adopting Mork. I feel like she would go for it. She's a nice person, and she would want to help her friends. I think she's probably left town by this point, sadly, but understandably. There's another sunny exterior of the house with snow on the ground. Mindy is saying that she couldn't believe when he said something, and then she realizes that Mork isn't with her. So I think she was thinking about what Exeter said, and now she can laugh about it. She calls Mork's name, and he enters and imitates Exeter, saying, Mindy, is that you? She's amused, but tells him to cut it out. He says he's just trying to be a chip off the old pop. He says Dad has been really nice to him. Exeter even put him in his will. Before, he was going to leave everything to his burrow, but now Mork is going to inherit a bale of hay. So yes, Exeter still has the burrow. Exeter was going to leave Mork the Colorado River, but Mork doesn't have any place to put it. Mindy is amused, but then she looks serious when they sit on the couch. She says they solved one problem, but now they have another one. For the first time, the government has records on him, which I don't think can be true, because the Russian immigrant episode aside, we had his Sandy hearing in the pilot. He spent time in jail, and there are probably other instances. I mean, they've dealt with the police. I'm sure that the government has other information on him. Not to mention, I don't know what Mindy does at tax time. Mark isn't worried because the immigration department closed its files on him, and Dad doesn't trust the adoption bureau. They're such important papers that he's going to put them in his private vault. It's behind Herman's house of fish in a dumpster. Mindy says it looks like he's safe for a while anyway.
You know, Min, we got real close to being married, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. Wonder what that would have been like. Mr. and Mrs. Mork.
Well, let's see. You know, after a while, I'd come home, open the door, and go, hi, Mindy. Hi, Dave. Hi, Rick. Wow. Hi, Dad. Wow, you look really good tonight. It's really nice to have you home. Then I'd sit in front of the TV on Sundays with a six-pack of ginger ale. And I'd sit there for a long time, and eventually, after a couple of years, I get a little ginger belly. Then we have to buy lots of aspirin for all the headaches you get at night. And then eventually, we get older, and a lot older. And we'd sit out on the front porch in our little motorized rocking chairs, and the chairs would rock for us. Every so often, I'd flip my little pacemaker clock real fast like that and turn it down. And then finally, one day, I'd lean over to you, take me about an hour to get real close. And then I'd lean over and whisper in your hearing aid. I'd say, Mindy, after all these years you've been so nice to me, I'm gonna tell you something that no one else knows. I'm really a...
They both seem to like the idea of them being married, Mr. and Mrs. Mork, as she puts it, but they don't really talk about the romantic side. In fact, him thinking that she's going to have headaches implies that she will not enjoy their sex life. And of course, we have him choosing Ozzie Nelson as his husband role model. His imitation of Ricky Nelson is kind of like his other imitations of teenage boys, a little bit facially like Ricky Nelson. And there's a reference to him drinking ginger ale, and we know that soft drinks can get him drunk. And we have one of his old man imitations, and she's very amused by all this. And then the end, he teases her about sharing a secret and not actually sharing it. There's a nighttime exterior of the house. Mork summons Orson, and he says, come in your Goodyear ship, so reference to the Goodyear blimps that would fly over ball games. He says that he had a close call and calls Orson your high and wideness. He was almost banned from the country. Orson wonders if Mork couldn't stay there, why didn't he move to another country, which we covered. Mork says it's easier said than done. The borders are guarded by an obstacle called red tape. Besides, he's grown accustomed to this place and to Mindy's face, which is a reference to the song I've Grown Accustomed to Her Face in the musical My Fair Lady. Orson wonders if Mork is welcome to remain there. Mork says there's this lady who's carrying a torch for him, which is reusing the torch joke from the first scene. And then he imitates Mae West as she says to bring her "you're tired, you're poor, and your huddled masses." Orson says it's a noble sentiment. Mork says there's also a man down at the immigration office who says not too tired, not too poor, and not too many. And I don't know if the judge is the man or just the man. Orson wonders how Mork convinced them to let him stay. He says he had to be adopted, and he explains that adoption is an earth custom that allows humans who like being parents to find others who need them. It's kind of like an emotional swap meet. And I feel like adoption should have come up on the episode where Mork wanted to buy a baby. Orson wonders if adoptive parents get any reward for this. Mork says their lives are richer for having done it. And that's how this country was founded, by adopting people from other nations.
First, a few Vikings, then some Spaniards, then some Englishmen, then some Africans, some Orientals, some Irish, then some Eastern Europeans. And before you know it, Orson, good Griffith, you got the birth of a nation. Until next week, sir. Nanu, nanu. Hey, what about us, Wash day.
And of course, some of this adoption was not consensual, as with the Africans. And we again have a thing of Mork doing various nationalities. It's well-meaning, but the reference to D.W. Griffith's racist classic film, Birth of a Nation, kind of undercuts it, and I don't know if that's deliberate. And of course, we have the irony of him ending as a Native American asking, "Hey, what about us?" It's an odd revisiting of the Russian immigrant episode. I don't know if they were running out of ideas at this point or they were just trying to put new spins on things. It's like with the Jeannie Loves Mork episode, offering us some deja vu. I found some of this episode funny, but it is so implausible and so rushed that I had to do willing suspension of disbelief in order to give it a 2.5 out of 0 to 4 eggs on my scale, which measures how well it delivers what I'm looking for in the series. There are weaker and less fun episodes this season, but I don't know that I would necessarily recommend it. Like I said, the guest performances are fine. Nothing really remarkable. It is nice to see Mr. Bickley and Exeter both back, although the Mr. Bickley scene is not really needed, but at least if you wondered, well, why not ask Mr. Bickley? This is why you would not ask Mr. Bickley. I'm not clear if Fred is back in town permanently yet. They don't consider the idea that Mork could become Mindy's adoptive brother instead of her adoptive son. I also rate each of these episodes on a 0 to 4 heart scale, which measures how well it supports the romantic relationship between Mork and Mindy. And this is an odd one because it does bring up the possibility of them getting married, and on another series it might have led to, if them not getting married, at least going towards that, and then at the end they might decide, no, these are the wrong reasons. But it pretty much just kills the ship, at least for the moment. They are not going to get married. Don't get your hopes up, at least at this point. Not for these reasons, anyway. And like I said, even when they imagine married life, it doesn't sound terribly romantic. We don't really think of Ozzie and Harriet as one of the classic romantic sitcom couples. You might think of them as parents, but they're no Ricky and Lucy. Problematic though they were, they're not even Ward and Jude Cleaver. I'm going to go with a 1.5. At least the subject is brought up. It's not really dwelt on. And it's another one of these episodes that is addressing the nature of parent and child relationships, although with the odd twist that now Exeter is sort of Mork's father, and I really doubt that there's going to be any continuity with that. My guess is Exeter probably won't even even remember the adoption a week later. The episode is somewhat skippable, but it's okay. If you watch it, it passes the time pleasantly enough. Like I said, there's some cute moments and definitely some topical humor, particularly to political and world events. I did say that the Russian immigrant episode was the most skippable of season 1, so having a follow-up to it is kind of unnecessary. You could do worse. 2.5 eggs, 1.5 hearts. This is Paula Schaffner with episode 44, Little Orphan Morkie. The sun will come out tomorrow, and Carlos loves Mary Beth Ovitz.
Thank you very much. Howdy. I'm the one that they're singing about. Yeah, I'm the Stars and Stripes forever. Star Spangled Banner. You can call me Old Glory, but let's just keep it simple. Just call me Flag. Oh, say, can you see? Okay. Little flag humor. Well, you probably don't recognize me. You say, who is that, Evel Knievel? No way. Yeah, you see, you can't recognize me because
I'm in my birthday suit, yes.
I'm wearing the original 13 here. Yeah. I remember Miss Betsy sitting there going,
oh, this could be the start of something big. Ooh. Oh, Tom, don't be a pain.
yes. I was born June 14th, 1777. That makes me a Gemini. Unpredictable, crazy.